The American victory at Omaha Beach was not a triumph of planning, it was a triumph of error. The heavy armor was at the bottom of the channel. The aerial bombardment missed by miles. The meticulously crafted schedule collapsed in minutes. If you are tired of history that only looks at generals moving flags on a map, this is for you. I'm Jack, and in this audiobook narrative, we are dissecting the friction of war. You are going to get a minute-by-minute breakdown of the first 2 hours of the invasion to see how a failed mission actually saved the day. We will follow Lieutenant John Spalding, a man who drifted off course, a man who thought he had failed. If Spalding had landed on target, he would have died. Instead, his navigational mistake became the only reason the Allies broke the Atlantic Wall. Victory did not belong to the precision of the strategy. It belonged to the chaos. To understand why the mistake was necessary, we first have to understand the machine it was up against. We have to zoom out from the bloody water of the shoreline and look at the geometry of the trap. The German defenses at Omaha were not a continuous line of men in trenches. They were a sophisticated network of strong points known as Widerstandsnests or resistance nests. They were numbered WN 60 through WN 72. These were not hastily dug foxholes. They were concrete fortresses reinforced with steel, buried into the bluffs overlooking the beach. They were designed with one specific purpose: enfilade fire. A machine gun firing directly at an approaching enemy is effective, but a machine gun firing from the side across the front of the enemy line is devastating. The German bunkers were angled. They were often invisible from the sea. They were built so that the gunners could sweep the beach from left to right, covering every inch of sand without ever exposing themselves to fire from the ships. The beach itself was a kill zone shaped like a crescent moon, 4 miles long. At low tide, the distance from the water to the seawall was nearly 400 yards. 400 yards of open ground, no cover, no holes, just flat, wet sand. The Germans had calculated the firing solutions for every square meter of that sand. They had pre-sighted their mortars. They had dialed in their artillery. They knew exactly how long it would take a man carrying 60 pounds of gear to run that distance. They knew he would move at a speed of roughly 4 miles per hour. They knew that in the deep sand, that speed would drop. At the center of this defense was WN 62. It was the strongest fortification on the beach. It commanded the sector known as Easy Red and Fox Green. Inside one of his firing pits sat a 20-year-old corporal named Heinrich Severlo. He was manning an MG-42. He had over 12,000 rounds of ammunition. He had a clear view of the entire beach. He was not a fanatic. He was a farmer's son. But on this morning, he was a component in a machine built to turn the Atlantic Ocean into a graveyard. This was the reality waiting for the Americans: a prepared, entrenched enemy with the high ground, superior optics, and overlapping fields of fire. Against this, the Allies brought the plan. The plan was a masterpiece of logistics. It was the largest amphibious operation in the history of the human species. It involved nearly 7,000 vessels. It involved 156,000 men. It involved a timeline detailed down to the minute. H hour was set for 0630. The plan relied on a sequence of events that had to happen in perfect order. First, under the cover of darkness, the aerial bombardment. Heavy bombers were to fly over the coast and drop thousands of tons of explosives on the German bunkers. This was supposed to neutralize the resistance nests. It was supposed to create craters on the beach that the infantry could use for cover. Second, the naval bombardment. Battleships and destroyers would pound the bluffs with heavy caliber shells. This was supposed to suppress the defenders and destroy the wire obstacles. Third, the DD tanks. These were the secret weapon. Sherman tanks fitted with canvas screens that allowed them to float. They were to launch from landing crafts 3 miles out to sea, swim to the beach, and arrive at H-5, 5 minutes before the infantry. They would provide armored fire support to knock out the remaining guns. Fourth, the combat engineers. They would land at H+3. Their job was to blow gaps in the obstacles so the follow-up waves could land. Finally, the infantry. They would land at H-hour. They would storm a beach that had been smashed by bombs, shelled by ships, and secured by tanks. They would mop up the day's survivors and move inland. It was a beautiful plan. It accounted for tides. It accounted for moon phases. It accounted for fuel consumption. But it did not account for the cloud cover. At 0600, the heavy bombers arrived over Normandy. The pilots looked down and saw nothing but thick gray clouds. They had strict orders not to drop their bombs unless they could visually identify the targets. They were terrified of hitting their own landing craft approaching the shore. So they waited. They delayed the drop by 30 seconds. 30 seconds at 200 miles per hour is a long distance. 13,000 bombs fell that morning. Not a single one hit the beaches of Omaha. They fell 3 miles inland. They killed French cows in the fields. They cratered empty pastures. The German bunkers were untouched. The wire was intact. The mines were live. The beach remained flat and smooth without a single crater for a soldier to hide in. The naval bombardment was brief, 40 minutes. It was barely enough time to wake the defenders up, let alone destroy concrete specifically reinforced to withstand it. The smoke from the shelling drifted across the water, obscuring the targets. The ships ceased fire as the landing craft approached, fearing friendly fire. Incidents. The German gunners shook the dust off their shoulders, checked their ammunition belts, and looked out at the sea. Then came the tanks, the secret weapon. The sea state was rough. The waves were 3 to 4 feet high. The DD tanks were designed for calm water. They were top-heavy. They were slow. The order was given to launch them 3 miles out. One by one, the canvas screens collapsed under the weight of the waves. One by one, the 30-ton steel coffins slipped beneath the surface. Of the 29 tanks launched for the eastern sector of Omaha, 27 sank. They took their crews with them to the bottom. The infantry was not arriving at H-hour supported by armor. They were arriving alone. The plan had assumed suppression. The reality was silence. As the landing craft approached the shore, the men inside could hear nothing but the roar of the engines and the slap of the waves. They assumed the silence meant the bombardment had worked. They assumed the Germans were dead or fleeing. They were wrong. The Germans were waiting. They had been ordered to hold their fire until the Americans were at the water's edge. They wanted the maximum number of targets in the kill zone. This brings us to Company A of the 116th Regiment. These were the Bedford Boys, National Guard troops from a small town in Virginia. They were assigned to Dog Green, the sector right in front of the Vierville draw. This was a natural exit from the beach, a paved road leading up through the bluffs. Because it was an exit, it was the most heavily defended point on the coast. The current in the English Channel runs strong from west to east. On the morning of June 6th, it was running even stronger than usual. The landing craft coxswains were struggling to keep their headings. The smoke from the naval shelling obscured the landmarks, but the boats of Company A were navigated well, too well. They corrected for the drift. They fought the current. They stayed on their line. They drove straight into the heart of the defense. When the ramp dropped on the lead boat of Company A, the illusion of the plan shattered. Captain Taylor Fellers was the first man out. He was killed instantly. The men behind him surged forward, driven by training and the desperate urge to get off the exposed boat. They jumped into water that was neck deep. They were carrying equipment that weighed as much as a small child: rifles, ammunition, mortars, radios, gas masks, entrenching tools, rations. As soon as they hit the water, the weight pulled them down. Then the bullets hit. The official records state that Company A ceased to be an effective fighting force within 10 minutes. That is a sterile way of saying that everyone was shot. Men were hit in the legs and drowned in 2 feet of water because they were too weak to stand up. Men were hit in the packs, the impact spinning them around, disorienting them until the next round found their head. There was no suppressing fire because there were no tanks. There was no cover because there were no bomb craters. There was nowhere to go but forward, and forward was death. By 0640, the water's edge at Dog Green was a slurry of red foam and khaki uniforms. The men who survived the initial burst were hiding behind the steel hedgehogs, the beach obstacles meant to rip the bottoms out of boats. They were shivering, wet, and terrified. They could hear the screams of their friends. They could hear the snap of bullets passing inches overhead. They were pinned. The plan had failed. The invasion at Omaha Beach was collapsing. But miles away, out in the chop of the channel, another boat was struggling. This is the boat of Lieutenant John Spalding. Spalding was a section leader in Company E, 16th Infantry Regiment. His target was the sector known as Easy Red. This was further east down the beach from the slaughter at Dog Green. Spalding was not a career soldier. He was a sports writer before the war. He was 29 years old. He was sitting in the front of his LCVP, soaking wet, trying to keep his map dry. His boat was in trouble. The waves were swamping the engine. The bilge pumps were screaming. The men were violently seasick. The vomit mixed with the seawater in the bottom of the boat. They were exhausted before they had even seen the enemy. But the biggest problem was the navigation. The smoke from the naval bombardment was thick. The landmarks Spalding had memorized from the aerial reconnaissance photos were invisible. The coxswain, the sailor driving the boat, was fighting the same rip current that had plagued the entire fleet. But unlike Company A, Spalding's boat was losing the fight. The current was pushing them east. It was pushing them left. They were drifting away from their assigned sector. They were drifting away from their assigned timetable. Spalding looked at his watch. They were late. Each hour had passed. He looked at the coastline. It didn't look right. He couldn't see the specific bunker he was supposed to attack. He couldn't see the landmarks. He felt a pit in his stomach, the fear of failure. In the military, landing in the wrong place is a cardinal sin. It throws off the coordination. It leaves flanks exposed. It jams up the logistics. Spalding thought he was failing his commander. He thought he was failing his men. He didn't know it yet, but that failure was the only thing that matters. The current pushed them nearly 1,000 yards off course. 1,000 yards is 10 football fields. In the precision of the invasion grid, that is a massive error. They were heading toward a section of the beach that was technically between two of the major German defense sectors, between WN 62 and WN 64. But there was something else happening on that stretch of beach, something that wasn't on any map, something that wasn't in any intelligence report. Earlier that morning, a stray naval shell had landed in the tall, dry grass on the bluffs. It hadn't hit a bunker. It hadn't killed any Germans. It had just started a fire. The grass was burning. Thick, acrid smoke was billowing out of the bluffs. The wind was blowing the smoke down the slope, rolling it over the sand and pushing it out to the water. The smoke was dense. It created a gray wall. To a military planner, smoke is a variable. It obscures vision. It creates confusion. But to the German gunners in WN 62, specifically to Heinz Severloh and his comrades, that smoke was a blindfold. The machine guns in the bunkers were positioned to interlock. Bunker A covers Bunker B's front and vice versa. But the smoke had drifted into the gap between the sectors. It created a dead zone, a blind spot. The gunners in WN 62 couldn't see into it. The gunners in WN 64 couldn't see into it. And right into the center of that smoke, carried by the error of the current and the failure of the navigation, drifted the boat of Lieutenant John Spalding. They weren't supposed to be there. The plan said they should be dying in front of the guns at Easy Red. The plan said they should be fighting through the wire. Instead, the ramp of Spalding's boat dropped into the sand at 0645. Spalding braced himself for the noise. He braced himself for the machine gun fire that tore Company A apart. He waited for the impact. Silence. Well, not silence. The roar of the battle was all around them. To their right, they could see the carnage at Easy Red. To their left, they could see the explosions at Fox Green. But directly in front of them, nothing, just smoke and sand. Spalding screamed, "Go, go, go!" His section, roughly 30 men, poured out of the boat. They hit the water. It was waist deep. They didn't drop. They didn't die. They splashed through the surf and hit the dry sand. They were the first Americans on Omaha Beach to land without taking a casualty. They ran across the sand. They expected the mines to go off. They expected the mortars to fall, but the Germans couldn't see them. The smoke was hiding them. The confusion of the battle was masking them. They reached the shingle, a bank of stones at the high water mark. This was usually where the soldiers would pin down and wait for death. But Spalding looked up. He saw the bluffs. He saw the barbed wire. But he didn't see any muzzle flashes directly above him. He realized the mistake. He realized the gap. He turned to his sergeant. "It looks like we're in a blind spot. This is the pivotal moment. This is the hinge of history. If Spalding stays on the beach, he survives, but the invasion fails. The men on the beach are trapped. The tide is coming in. The Germans are chewing them up. Someone has to get off the sand. Someone has to open the door." Spalding made a decision. He didn't wait for the demolition teams to blow the wire. He didn't wait for orders from headquarters. He ordered his men to cut the wire with hand cutters. They snipped through the strands. Snap, snap, snap. They crawled through the gap. They were now at the base of the bluffs. They were in the tall grass, the same grass that was burning. The smoke was stinging their eyes, but it was also wrapping them in a cloak of invisibility. They began to climb. While Company A was being eradicated at Dog Green, while the tanks were sinking, while the generals on the ships were beginning to panic and consider abandoning the invasion, Lieutenant Spalding and his section of lost soldiers were crawling up the face of the Atlantic Wall. They were not conquering heroes. They were terrified men who had gotten lucky. But they were about to turn that luck into a weapon. To understand the magnitude of what they were doing, we need to look at the timeline of the disaster unfolding everywhere else. By 0700, 30 minutes after H hour, the situation on Omaha was critical. The first wave was effectively destroyed. The second wave was landing in the wreckage of the first. The beach was cluttered with burning tanks and smashed landing craft. The tide was rising rapidly, hiding the obstacles under the water. The coxswains of the incoming boats couldn't see the mines. They were driving over them. Boats were exploding. The wounded were drowning as the tide came in. The medics were overwhelmed. They were running out of bandages. They were running out of morphine. They were running out of hope. General Omar Bradley, commanding the American First Army from the cruiser USS Augusta, was receiving reports. They were fragmented. They were hysterical. Entire wave wiped out. Pinned down. Taking heavy fire. No exits open. Bradley was a calm man, but he was staring at a catastrophe. He began to draft a plan to evacuate the beach, to pull the survivors off and divert the follow-up waves to Utah Beach or the British sectors. If Bradley gives that order, D-Day fails. If Omaha holds, the Allied beachhead is split in two. The Germans can drive a wedge between the Americans and the British. They can counterattack. They can push the invasion back into the sea. The fate of the Western world was hanging by a thread. And that thread was Lieutenant Spalding climbing a hill he wasn't supposed to be on. Spalding's men reached the top of the bluff. They were now behind the German trench line. They were behind the machine guns that were slaughtering the men on the beach. They paused. They checked their weapons. Their rifles were full of sand. They had to clean them. They had to clear the jams. They looked around. To their right, they saw the rear of a concrete pillbox. It was part of WN-62. They could hear the machine gun inside firing, the steady, ripping sound of the MG-42. Bert! Bert! The gunners inside were focused on the beach. They were focused on the targets in front of them. They had no idea that 30 Americans were standing 50 yards behind them. The plan said the bunkers would be destroyed by bombs. That didn't happen. The plan said the tanks would suppress them. That didn't happen. The reality was that the only thing that could stop that machine gun was a guy named Phil Streczyk. Sergeant Phil Streczyk was Spalding's second in command. He was a tough veteran. He had fought in North Africa and Sicily. He was the kind of NCO who knew how to stay alive. Streczyk motioned to the men. "Come on." They moved toward the trench line. They jumped in. This was the moment the Atlantic Wall was breached. Not by a tank shell, not by a bomber, but by boots hitting the dirt in a trench that was supposed to be secure. The Germans in the trench were stunned. They turned around and saw American uniforms. Before they could raise their rifles, Spalding's men opened fire. It was close quarters. Savage. personal. The Americans were fueled by the adrenaline of survival and the rage of seeing their friends die on the beach below. They cleared the trench. They moved toward the bunker. This brings us to the first major confrontation, the first domino that had to fall. The bunker facing the beach was a fortress, but like all fortresses, it had a weakness. It had a back door, and the back door was open. Spalding and Streczyk approached the rear of the emplacement. They threw grenades. The explosions echoed inside the concrete. Dust and smoke poured out. The firing from the bunker stopped. For the first time since 0630, one of the guns at Easy Red went silent. On the beach below, the men pinned behind the shingle noticed the change. The volume of fire dropped. Not much, but enough. A few heads popped up. A few men looked at the bluffs. They saw the smoke. But now, instead of just smoke, they saw figures moving on the skyline. American figures. Someone shouted, "They're up! They're up the hill!" Hope is a powerful tactical advantage. When soldiers believe they are going to die, they freeze. When they believe there is a way out, they move. Spalding's mistake had created a crack in the German defense. Now he had to pry it open. But the Germans were not going to give up easily. The network of bunkers was interconnected. As soon as Spalding took out the first position, the neighboring positions reacted. They turned their guns inward. They started firing at Spalding's small group. They were now alone, behind enemy lines with limited ammunition, no radio contact with the ships, and no idea where the rest of their company was. Spalding checked his men. They were shaken, but they were alive. "We keep moving," he said. "We roll them up." They began to move west along the top of the bluffs. Their goal was to clear the defenses overlooking the draw, to open the exit for the tanks and trucks that were waiting on the beach. But to do that, they would have to walk through a minefield, literally. The Germans had planted thousands of S-mines, bouncing Bettys. These were nasty devices. When you stepped on the trigger, a small charge would launch the mine into the air about waist high. Then the main charge would detonate, spraying hundreds of steel balls in all directions. It was designed to mime, not just kill. A wounded man takes two other men out of the fight to carry him. Spalding didn't have a mine detector. He didn't have engineers. Streczyk took the lead. He had an instinct for it. He looked at the ground. He looked for the telltale prongs. He looked for the disturbed earth. "Step where I step," he told the men. They walked in single file, a conga line of death. One wrong step and the section disappears. They moved through the minefield. They took fire from snipers. They took mortar fire, but they kept moving. As they moved, they encountered other pockets of resistance. A machine gun nest here, a mortar pit there. They engaged them. They flanked them. They destroyed them. Every gun they silenced reduced the pressure on the beach. Every German they killed was one less rifle aiming at the waves. It is important to pause here and consider the scale. We are talking about 30 men. 30 men in a battle involving hundreds of thousands. Statistically, they were insignificant. They were a rounding error. But in a complex system like a beach defense, small changes can have cascading effects. Think of the German defense as a taut cable. It is under immense tension. It is holding back a massive weight. It is strong, but it is rigid. If you cut one strand of that cable, the tension increases on the remaining strands. If you cut another, The tension spikes again. Eventually, the cable snaps. Spalding and Streczyk were the wire cutters. They were snapping the strands one by one. Back on the beach, the chaos was slowly organizing itself. A brigadier general named Norman Coda was walking upright among the men. He was smoking a cigar. He was ignoring the bullets. He found a group of Rangers. "Rangers, lead the way," he shouted. He found the remnants of the 116th. "There are two kinds of people who are staying on this beach," he yelled. "The dead and those who are going to die. Now let's get the hell out of here." He pointed to the bluffs. He pointed to where Spalding had gone. "They made it," Coda said. "So can we." The men began to move. They blew gaps in the wire with Bangalore torpedoes. They rushed the slopes. They followed the path that Spalding had inadvertently blazed. But the battle was far from over. The exit was still blocked. The big bunker complex guarding the draw was still active. And deep inside the German lines, the reserves were mobilizing. Spalding was about to run headfirst into a counterattack, and he was about to find out that his navigational error had put him on a collision course with the most dangerous man on the beach. This brings us to the end of the opening phase. The beach is a slaughterhouse. The plan is in ruins. The dead are piling up in the tide. But the door is cracked open, just a sliver. In the next part, we will see what happens when Spalding tries to kick that door down. We will see the mechanics of the German response. We will analyze the specific weaponry that made the hedgerows of Normandy a nightmare. And we will see how a single decision by a German commander to conserve ammunition ended up sealing the fate of the Third Reich. The mistake got them up the hill. Now they had to survive the summit. The time is 0745. The tide is now fully high. On the beach below, the water is lapping against the seawall. The wreckage of the invasion is compressed into a strip of sand less than 10 yards wide. Up on the bluffs, Lieutenant John Spalding and his 30 men are no longer just survivors. They are ghosts. They are moving through the high grass behind the German lines. They are wet, sand-covered, and invisible. They are moving west. Their objective is the town of St. Laurent and the draw at E1, the exit road that leads up from the slaughter at Easy Red. To understand why this movement was so critical, we have to look at the German nervous system. The German defense of Normandy was not designed to be a static brawl. It was designed to be a trap. The plan was simple. Let the enemy land, pin them on the beach with the bunkers, and then, while they are bleeding in the sand, hit them with a mobile counterattack from the reserves inland. At 0750, the German commander of the 352nd Infantry Division, General Kress, was sitting in his headquarters miles away. He was looking at his map. He was receiving reports from WN-62 and WN-60. The reports said the Americans were pinned. They said the invasion was stopped. General Kress believed he was winning. Based on this information, he committed his reserves. But he didn't send them to the bluffs where Spalding was walking. He sent them to the flanks. He thought the center was secure. He thought the wire was intact. He did not know about the navigational error. He did not know about the smoke. He did not know that 30 Americans were currently dismantling his defense from the inside out. Because Spalding was in the blind spot, no one had radioed his position. Because he was behind the bunkers, the observers couldn't see him. Spalding and Streczyk moved toward WN-64. This was a resistance nest guarding the E-1 draw. It had a 75mm anti-tank gun, mortars, and machine guns. The terrain here changed. They weren't just in grass anymore. They were entering the bocage, the hedgerows. If you have never seen a Normandy hedgerow, you cannot understand the violence of the fighting that followed. These are not garden hedges. They are earthen walls, 4 to 6 feet high, topped with thick tangles of ancient roots, thorns, and trees. They are centuries old. They divide the fields into small enclosed kill boxes. To a tank, a hedgerow is a wall. To a bullet, it is a sponge. To a soldier, it is a fortress. Spalding's men were moving along the spine of the bluff, using the vegetation for cover. They came upon a German dugout. It was a logistics node, a supply trench. Streczyk raised his hand, fist closed. Halt, he pointed. Ahead of them, a German officer was shouting orders. He was trying to organize a firing line to shoot down at the beach. He was so focused on the men in the water that he didn't hear the wet boots on the dirt behind him. Streczyk didn't fire. A gunshot is a dinner bell. It tells everyone where you are. Instead, he rushed. Violence in war is usually depicted as loud, explosions, screaming. But the most effective violence is often quiet. It is the sudden, jarring physical confrontation. Streczyk was on the German officer before the man could draw his Luger. A rifle butt to the shoulder. A shout in English. Hands up! The German officer froze. He looked at Streczyk. He looked at the line of dirty, wet Americans emerging from the smoke like demons. He surrendered. This moment is statistically irrelevant. One prisoner. But tactically, it was a thunderclap. This officer was the link between the bunkers and the headquarters. When he raised his hands, the chain of command broke. The bunkers he was coordinating were now fighting blind. Spalding didn't stop to celebrate. He pressed the advantage. Keep moving, he hissed. They reached the perimeter of WN-64. This was the hard part. The bunker was facing the sea, but it had defensive positions facing the rear. Tobruk's, small concrete pits flush with the ground, manned by a single soldier with a machine gun or a mortar. They were hard to spot and harder to kill. The Americans had to clear them one by one. This is where the difference between the plan and the reality becomes stark. The plan called for flamethrowers. The plan called for satchel charges. Spalding's men had lost most of their heavy gear in the water. They didn't have flamethrowers. They had grenades, and they had grit. The tactic was brutal and simple. One man lays down covering fire at the slit of the Tobruk, keeping the German's head down. Another man crawls through the grass, pulls the pin, waits 2 seconds, and tosses the grenade into the hole. Thump. Silence. Move to the next one. They did this repeatedly. They were dismantling the fortress brick by brick. But as they worked their way west, the resistance stiffened. The Germans realized something was wrong behind them. The machine guns in WN-64 swung around. Bullets started tearing through the brush. The leaves were shredded. Dirt kicked up in Spalding's face. Get down! They hit the dirt. They were pinned. This is the moment where the mistake faces its stress test. Spalding is isolated. If he gets wiped out here, the gap closes. The Germans reoccupy the trenches. The invasion stalls again. But Spalding had something the Germans didn't. He had the initiative, and he had the high ground, not physically, but psychologically. The Germans in WN-64 were confused. They were hearing shooting from their rear. They were hearing shouting in English. They assumed they were surrounded. They assumed a major breakthrough had occurred. They didn't know it was just one section of one platoon. Fear is a force multiplier. Spalding ordered his barman Browning automatic rifle to suppress the German position. The bar fires a 30-06 round. It punches through wood. It punches through light cover. The heavy, rhythmic thud, thud, thud of the bar terrified the German conscripts. Under that cover, Streczyk flanked the left. He got close to the main ventilation shaft of the bunker complex. He fired a full clip of his M1 Garand into the opening. The sound of the rounds ricocheting inside the concrete was deafening. The firing from WN-64 stopped. A white flag appeared. 21 German soldiers walked out. 21 men who had been holding down an entire company on the beach. They surrendered to a handful of Americans who shouldn't have been there. Spalding checked his watch. It was 8:30. In 2 hours, thanks to a navigational error, his section had landed, climbed an impassable bluff, cleared a trench line, neutralized 2 major resistance nests, and captured more prisoners than they had men. But the most significant impact wasn't the prisoners, it was the silence. Down on the beach, the men of the 16th Infantry Regiment were huddling behind the shingle at Easy Red. They were waiting to die. But then they noticed something. The enfilade fire from the right, from WN-64, had stopped. The crossfire was broken. A major on the beach stood up. "The fire's lifting. Get the Bangalores." Engineers rushed forward to the wire. Boom. A gap was blown, then another. Men started pouring through. They weren't being cut down by the side fire anymore. They were rushing up the draw that Spalding had just unlocked. This is the cause and effect chain. The navigational error led to the blind spot. The blind spot led to the infiltration. The infiltration led to the silence of WN-64. The silence led to the breakout at Easy Red. Victory is not a straight line. It is a domino effect. But as Spalding moved further west, the story takes a darker turn. The Germans were waking up. The shock was wearing off. To the west lay St. Laurent. And in St. Laurent, there were German units that were not distracted by the beach. They were fresh, and they were angry. Spalding's men were running low on ammo. They had scavenged German Mausers. They were using enemy grenades. They were exhausted. The adrenaline crash was coming, and they were about to run into the most dangerous man I mentioned earlier. He wasn't a general. He wasn't a famous ace. He was a sniper. German doctrine placed high value on snipers. They were not just marksmen. They were terror weapons. They were trained to target officers and NCOs, to decapitate the leadership. As Spalding's group moved into the outskirts of the village, the crack of a single rifle shot rang out. One of Spalding's men dropped, hit in the neck. The group scrambled for cover. The hedgerows that had protected them were now hiding their executioner. "Where is he?" Streczyk yelled. "I don't see him." Another shot. Another man hit. They were frozen. A single man with a telescopic sight was pinning down the unit that had just broken the Atlantic Wall. This is the friction of war. You can defeat a bunker complex. You can outflank a company, but you can still be stopped cold by one man in a tree. Spalding had to make a choice. Stay and hunt the sniper, risking time and lives, or bypass him and push for the village. If they stayed, the momentum died. The Germans would regroup. If they bypassed him, they left a killer in their rear to pick off the reinforcements coming up the trail. Spalding looked at Streczyk. Streczyk looked back. His eyes were hard. "We flush him," Streczyk said. What happened next was a micro battle of cat and mouse. It involved no artillery, no air support, just men crawling through the mud, listening for the bolt action of a rifle. They split up. 2 teams, one to draw fire, one to kill. It was a gamble. It required someone to stand up and be the bait. Private First Class Richard Gallagher volunteered. He grabbed a helmet on a stick. He lifted it above the hedgerow. Crack. The helmet spun. The shot came from a cluster of apple trees to the north. Streczyk saw the muzzle flash. He didn't hesitate. He emptied his rifle into the tree line. Leaves fell. A body fell. The sniper was dead. But the delay had cost them 20 precious minutes. And in those 20 minutes, the German 916th Grenadier Regiment had begun to move into Saint Laurent. Spalding's group was now walking into a head-on collision with a counterattack force. We need to zoom out again to understand the stakes. By 0900, the American hold on the beach was still fragile. Yes, troops were moving up the bluffs, but there were no tanks inland. There was no artillery inland. The infantry was light. If the German 916th could push through Saint Laurent and recapture the bluffs, they could shoot down into the rear of the Americans climbing the hill. They could seal the breach. Spalding was the only thing standing in their way. He didn't know he was facing a regiment. He thought he was just clearing a village. As they entered the streets of Saint Laurent, the air changed. It smelled of cordite and burning thatch. The houses were stone, thick walls, good defensive positions. Suddenly, a German machine gun opened up from a second-story window. The Americans dove into doorways. They were engaged. But this time, they weren't fighting bewildered bunker troops. They were fighting Panzer Grenadiers, mobile infantry. The firefight that erupted in Saint Laurent was chaotic, house to house, room to room. Spalding realized he was outgunned. He grabbed his radio operator. "Get me naval fire. Get me anything." But the radio was dead. Saltwater corrosion. They were on their own. And then the ammunition situation became critical. "I've got 1 clip left," someone shouted. "I'm out of grenades." The Germans sensed the weakness. They began to press. They were maneuvering to flank Spalding. This is the moment where the mistake should have ended in tragedy. The unit that drifted too far went too deep and got cut off. But then a sound, a low rumble, a mechanical grinding noise. Coming from the south? No, coming from the beach. Spalding looked back down the trail they had blazed. Through the smoke, lurching up the steep dirt track of the E1 draw, came a monster. It was a tank, a single Sherman tank. It had made it off the beach. It had survived the drowning. It had survived the mines. It was clanking up the hill, its engine roaring, its 75 gun traversing. It wasn't part of Spalding's unit. It was a stray. Another mistake, a lost tank looking for a fight. Spalding waved his arms. "Over here! Over here!" The tank commander saw him. The turret swung toward the stone house where the German machine gun was firing. Boom! The house disintegrated. The machine gun fell silent. The arrival of that one tank shifted the balance of power in Saint Laurent instantly. The German infantry, seeing armor, pulled back. They assumed it was the spearhead of an armored column. They didn't know it was just one lost tank. They retreated to the next hedgerow line. Spalding had held the village. He had held the high ground. But the cost was mounting. His men were bleeding. They were shaking. They had been fighting for 3 hours without pause. The time is 1,000 hours. The sun is fully up. The smoke that saved Spalding is beginning to thin, blown away by the channel breeze. We leave St. Laurent for a moment and zoom back out to the beach. The scene is no longer just a slaughter. It is a traffic jam of apocalyptic proportions. The plan called for vehicles to move off the beach immediately. But because the exits were blocked for so long, the vehicles are piling up. Trucks, jeeps, bulldozers, tanks. They are bumper to bumper on the narrow strip of shingle. This is a target-rich environment. The German artillery observers in the distance are looking at this glut of metal and flesh. They pick up their radios. The shells begin to fall again. But this time, something is different. The German fire is sporadic. It lacks the coordinated, rhythmic intensity of the early morning. Why? Because the nervous system of the defense is dying. Remember the German officer Spalding captured? The one who surrendered in the dugout? That was not an isolated incident. Across the bluffs, wherever small groups of lost Americans had penetrated the line, telephone wires were being cut. Runners were being shot. Observation posts were going dark. General Kreis at the 352nd Division headquarters was now blind. He was trying to move pieces on a board that no longer existed. He ordered the 916th Regiment to counterattack at St. Laurent. He ordered the engineers to blow the bridges. But orders required transmission, and the transmission lines had been severed by men who were just trying to find a place to hide. Back in St. Laurent, Spalding and his exhausted section were still holding the line. They were down to their last rounds. The adrenaline had faded, replaced by the heavy, leaden fatigue of combat. But they were not alone anymore. The gap they had opened at E1 was widening. The trickle of men coming up the draw was turning into a stream, and leading that stream was the brass. General Norman Cota, the man who had walked through the fire on the beach, arrived at the top of the bluff. He wasn't sitting in a command tent. He was on the ground, waving a pistol. He saw the chaos. He saw the intermingled units, Rangers mixed with infantry, engineers mixed with cooks. The plan relied on unit cohesion. Company A stays with Company A. Platoon 1 stays with Platoon 1. The reality was a soup of strangers. Cota didn't try to sort them out. He didn't try to restore the organizational chart. He weaponized the disorder. U5, go left. U10, follow that tank. You, get that machine gun up here. He was building ad hoc combat teams on the fly. He was embracing the improvisation that Spalding had started. This is a critical distinction in warfare. The German system relied on rigid hierarchy. If the officer dies, the NCO takes over. If the NCO dies, the unit waits for orders. The American system, by accident or design, was modular. If the officer dies, a private says, let's go kill that guy. By 11:30, these ad hoc groups were pushing deep into the bocage. They were fighting ugly. They weren't using standard tactics. They were using bazookas to blow holes in hedgerows. They were using captured German weapons. But the Germans were still fighting back. And they had one advantage left: the interior lines. They knew the terrain. They had pre-dug fallback positions. As Spalding's group tried to push out of St. Laurent to link up with the units from the Vierville draw, they ran into a kill zone that hadn't been on the maps, a sunken road. In Normandy, centuries of cart traffic had worn the dirt roads down until they were 5 or 6 feet below the level of the fields. These were natural trenches. Spalding's men approached the road. It was quiet, too quiet. Suddenly, mortars started walking down the line. Crump, crump, crump. It wasn't direct fire. It was indirect fire, guided by a spotter. "Pull back!" Streczyk yelled. They scrambled back into the ruins of the village. They were stuck again. If they couldn't cross the road, they couldn't link the beachheads. If they couldn't link the beachheads, the invasion was still just a series of isolated pockets, vulnerable to being crushed one by one. They needed a breaker. And once again, the solution came from a mistake. Miles offshore, the USS Texas, a battleship the size of a city block, was receiving frantic calls for fire support. But the radios were jammed. The coordinates were garbled. The gunnery officers were hesitant to fire into the confusing mix of friend and foe. But a destroyer, the USS Frankfurt, decided to break the rules. The captain of the Frankfurt ordered his ship to turn 90 degrees and steam directly at the beach. He wasn't staying in the designated fire support lane. He was driving his ship into the shallows. He got so close that the keel was scraping the sand. He was essentially turning a destroyer into a tank. The sailors on the deck could see the individual soldiers on the bluffs. They could see the machine gun nests in the sunken road that were pinning Spalding down. The captain didn't wait for a forward observer. He ordered the gunners to fire over open sights, direct fire. The 5-inch guns of the Frankfurt leveled out. Boom, boom, boom. The shells slammed into the sunken road with pinpoint accuracy. The earth erupted. The German mortar teams were vaporized. The hedgerows collapsed. Spalding, watching from the village, saw the destruction. He didn't know who was firing. He didn't care. "Go now!" They charged across the open ground. They crossed the sunken road. They found the German positions destroyed, the equipment shattered. They kept moving. At 1200 hours on a dirt path between St. Laurent and Vierville, Lieutenant Spalding saw movement ahead, figures in olive drab. He raised his hand. "Hold fire." The figures approached. It was a platoon from the N-16th. They had come up the Vierville draw. They looked just like Spalding's men, hollow-eyed, covered in mud, bleeding. The two officers met in the middle of the road. They didn't salute. They just nodded. The beachhead was linked. The navigational error that had sent Spalding east had allowed him to flank the defenses that were slaughtering the 116th. The collapse of the 116th's plan had forced them to improvise and push through the Vierville draw. Two failures had met in the middle to create a success. But as the afternoon wore on, the magnitude of the cost began to settle in. The shooting was moving inland, but the beach was still there. The tide was going out now, and as the water receded, it revealed what the morning had hidden. The bodies, thousands of them. They were snagged on the obstacles. They were piled in the shingle. They were drifting in the surf. Spalding didn't see this. He was inland. But the men coming ashore in the later waves saw it. The clerks, the truck drivers, the headquarters staff. They walked off the ramps and stepped into a nightmare. This visual is important because it reinforces the thesis. The plan had assumed 3,000 casualties for the first day. The reality was approaching that number in the first few hours. The victory was being won, but the machine that built the victory was broken. It was running on fumes and blood. By 1300, General Bradley on the Augusta finally received the message. Troops advancing inland, exits E1 and D1 open. He put down his coffee. He let out a breath he had been holding for 6 hours. He didn't order the evacuation. He ordered the follow-on waves to land. The crisis had passed. Not because the strategy worked, but because the men on the ground refused to let it fail. But for Spalding and Streczyk, the war wasn't over. It was just beginning. They had survived the beach. They had survived the bluffs. They had survived the village. Now they had to survive the accolades. The Army loves a hero. It needs a hero to sell the war bonds. It needs a hero to reassure the public that the plan is working. Spalding and Streczyk were about to be pulled out of the line. They were about to be turned into symbols. But symbols don't have nightmares. Men do. As the sun began to set on June 6, 1944, the fighting died down to a sporadic rumble. The Americans dug in for the night. They expected a massive counterattack. They checked their ammo. They ate cold rations. Spalding sat in a foxhole near St. Laurent. He looked at his map, the map that had been useless that morning. He traced the line of their movement, a jagged, erratic line that made no sense militarily, a line drawn by drift and error. He realized then that he shouldn't be alive. By all the laws of probability, he should be floating in the channel. He looked at Streczyk. The sergeant was cleaning his rifle, staring into the middle distance. He wasn't celebrating, he was mourning. They had won, but they had lost the innocence of the plan. They knew now that war wasn't about arrows on a map. It was about inches. It was about seconds. It was about the wind blowing smoke to the left instead of the right. This brings us to the threshold of the end. The battle is won. The beachhead is secure. The history books are ready to be written. But history books lie. They smooth out the rough edges. They draw straight lines where there were crooked ones. They talk about strategy and logistics. In the final part of this audiobook, we are going to correct the record. We are going to look at the hard numbers. We are going to reveal the specific statistic that proves just how fragile this victory was. And we are going to see what happened to John Spalding and Phil Streczyk after the guns went silent. Because the mistake that saved the invasion eventually caught up with them. The sun sets on June 6th. The smoke clears. The numbers begin to come in. And this is where the story of the perfect plan finally dies. We need to look at one devastating statistic that reframes everything you have just heard. Of the 43,250 infantrymen who were scheduled to land on Omaha Beach on D-Day, how many do you think were responsible for actually neutralizing the German defenses? How many men physically knocked out the bunkers, cut the wire, and opened the exits? If you look at the official after-action reports, if you trace the movements of every unit, the number is shocking. It wasn't 20,000. It wasn't 10,000. It was less than 400. 400 men. That is less than 1% of the landing force. While thousands were pinned behind the shingle, paralyzed by the shock of the plan's failure, these few hundred individuals, scattered, often lost, usually acting without orders, did the work of an entire army. They were the anomaly. They were the statistical outliers. And Lieutenant John Spalding's section was the first of them. This brings us to the resolution of our story, the consequences of the mistake. In the weeks that followed, the Army tried to understand what happened. They interviewed Spalding. They interviewed Streczyk. They traced their path on the maps. They realized that if Spalding's boat had not drifted east, if it had landed where it was supposed to at Easy Red, his section would likely have been annihilated, just like the others. There would have been no flank attack on WN-64. There would have been no silence. The exit would have stayed closed. The navigational error didn't just save Spalding's life. It saved the timeline of the invasion. For his actions on June 6th, Lieutenant John Spalding was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. He was pulled off the line. The Army realized he was more valuable as a symbol than as a rifleman. He was sent back to the United States. He went on a war bond tour. He stood on stages in high school gymnasiums and Rotary clubs. He shook hands with mayors. He told them about the bravery of the American soldier. But he didn't tell them about the vomit in the boat. He didn't tell them about the blind spot. He didn't tell them that the only reason he was standing there was because a patch of grass caught fire and a sailor turned the wheel too far to the left. He carried the burden of the survivor, the knowledge that his life was a rounding error. And then there was Phil Streczyk, the sergeant who sensed the mines, the man who kicked down the door of the Atlantic Wall. He didn't get a tour. He stayed in the fight. He fought through the hedgerows. He fought through France. He fought into Germany. But everyone has a limit. The human mind is not a machine. It cannot process indefinite horror. In the Hurtgen forest, months later, in a battle even worse than Omaha, Streczyk finally broke. The man who had been fearless on the beach simply stopped. His nervous system collapsed. He was evacuated for combat fatigue. He survived the war physically, but he never left the beach. He returned home to New Jersey. He tried to live a normal life. But the silence of the blind spot haunted him. Decades later, the hero of Omaha Beach took his own life. The history books don't like to talk about that part. It doesn't fit the narrative of the Great Crusade, but it is the essential truth of war. The victory at Omaha was paid for by men like Streczyk, who spent everything they had in a single morning. So what is the final verdict? What is the lesson of the mistake? We live in a world obsessed with optimization. We build systems. We crave efficiency. We believe that if we have enough data, enough planning, enough technology, we can eliminate failure. D-Day proves that is a lie. The Allies had the best intelligence, the most ships, and the most detailed plan in history. And within 10 minutes, it was worthless. The system failed. What succeeded was the human element, the capacity for adaptation, the ability to look at a disaster, find a crack in the wall, and improvise a way through. Victory didn't come from the generals on the ships. It came from a 29-year-old sports writer and a sergeant who refused to die, walking up a hill they weren't supposed to be on. We return now to the image we started with. 0630 hours, the ramp drops. But this time, we don't see the perfect plan. We don't see the arrows on the map. We see the chaos, we see the smoke, we see the current pulling the boat sideways. And we realize that this error wasn't a flaw. It was the miracle. It is a reminder that in the grand calculus of history, the difference between victory and defeat often isn't measured in tons of explosives or millions of dollars. Sometimes it's measured in the drift of the tide. Sometimes the wrong place is the only right place to be. My name is Jack, and this has been a war audiobook narrative about the mistake that won the war.